Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, the direct route to PMP exam success. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome back to the Project Management Prepcast, the least riskiest way to prepare for your PMP exam. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner. We are moving on to the Perform Qualitative Risk Analysis process, which involves assessing the potential impact and likelihood of the identified risks in order to prioritize them so that you as the project manager, together with your project management team, will focus most of your energy and time on those risks that are most likely to impact the project. We want to save you time from being spent on risks that are of low probability or low impact, or both. So, in this lesson, we are going to be examining and discussing the difference between the qualitative and quantitative risk analysis. We explore why we do this qualitative risk analysis at all. We look at additional factors that we have to consider. We'll discuss probability and impact assessment and matrices. We'll see everything that you need to see about risk categorization, and we'll talk about risk urgency. The lesson has two parts. In part one, we're going to take a look at the overview and the inputs, and then in part two, we'll look at the outputs, the tools and techniques, and review. And yes, just for fun, we listed them in the wrong order there in part two. Gotta be different sometimes. Let's begin with the knowledge area. Project risk management includes the processes of conducting risk management planning, identification, analysis, response planning, and controlling risk on a project. And this definition then translates exactly into 6 processes that we have in project risk management. The first one is plan risk management, the process of defining how we will conduct risk management activities on our project. Then we have to identify our risks. This is the process of determining which risks may affect the project and documenting their characteristics. At the end of this process, we will have a very, very long list of risks. Which ones should we focus on? Well, we have 2 processes that are going to tell us about this. The first one is perform qualitative risk analysis, the process of prioritizing risks for further analysis or action by assessing and combining their probability of occurrence and impact. And the second process that helps us to analyze is perform quantitative risk analysis, the process of numerically analyzing the effect of identified risks on overall project objectives. Now that we're focusing just on a small subset of that big list of risks that we had created in the identify risks process, we're now going to have to plan our risk responses. What are we going to do about all these risks? This is the process of developing options and actions to enhance opportunities and to reduce threats to project objectives. And of course, in the end, it's really all about one thing. We want to control our risks in the process of implementing risk response plans, tracking identified risks, monitoring residual risks, identifying new risks, and evaluating risk process effectiveness throughout the project. In terms of the processes and process groups, project risk management is very much like project time management, where most of the processes fall into the planning process group. So, perform qualitative risk analysis. The focus of this lesson is a planning process. The main concept to understand for this process is that the identified risks need to be prioritized qualitatively. The reason for this step is because the risk identification process may have created a risk register that contains 500 or more risks. They may be big, medium, small, or even teeny tiny little risks, but we don't know that yet. So we need to take a closer look at our risks and understand each one better in order to prioritize the most important ones for further analysis, mitigation, and then response planning. We do this by determining the combination of probability and impact of that risk occurring. This reduces the level of uncertainty that is associated with that risk, which then in turn permits us to focus first on high probability and high impact risks. Let's continue this lesson by explaining the primary difference between the processes of perform qualitative risk analysis and perform quantitative risk analysis. So, in project risk management, you need to first perform a qualitative risk analysis in order to classify that big list of risks and then score each risk in terms of probability and impact, and generally classify your risks as low, medium, and high priority. You're actually assigning these three words to each risk. Risk 1 is low priority, risk 2 is medium priority, risk 3 is high priority, and so on. Then, based on the general priority that you have just assigned to all 500 of your risks, you perform a second process. Perform quantitative risk analysis. And here, based on the consequences, based on the impact and trends for each risk, you assign a quantitative or numerical value to each and every one of your risks. Once we have a value for the risk, we can then assign an order of priority and focus our attention on the most important risks first. So, step 1, which risks are low, medium, and high priority, and then step 2, perform quantitative risk analysis. There we're assigning a numerical value to each risk so that we can sort it by priority. I think by now you understand the why we do the qualitative risk analysis, but just to drive the point home. When analyzing our risks, we don't want to assess each of what might be a 500 risk list in detail. The first step is a triage, like what is done when treating a group of wounded soldiers. The benefits of the qualitative risk analysis are quick identification and determination of the most important risks. We have a prioritization of the risks. We have rapid and cost-effective analysis, and we focus our energy and resources only on the high probability, high impact risks. Some additional factors to consider when you're performing the qualitative risk analysis are the time frame or urgency that is appropriate for the identified risk, the risk tolerance of your organization, which will significantly influence risk analysis, and this risk tolerance is often a function of project constraints like cost, schedule, scope, or quality. But we also need to know the risk attitudes of our stakeholders. Are they risk averse? Are they risk neutral? Or are they risk seekers? This will very much determine how much effort we're going to put into project risk management. And then all of this will lead us to identification and management of our approach towards project risk management, so that any bias is also identified. And bias meaning, of course, that risk that is high probability to me might be low probability to you. So we want to correct any bias in our approach that we identified by establishing well-defined levels of probability and impact and accounting for the time criticality, which may magnify a risk's importance and the quality of the information available about the risk. One final note about this process before we move on to the inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs. Normally, the processes in project risk management are executed in the order of first we identify our risks, then we perform the qualitative risk analysis, and then we move on to the quantitative risk analysis. However, what you may do is you may go from identify risks straight to perform quantitative risk analysis if you have an experienced risk manager on your project who can tell just by looking at the list of risks that you have identified there in identified risks which one are the most critical ones that we need to look at. So experience plays a big role there, but generally speaking we do execute these processes in order. And don't forget, all risk management processes are also iterative in their nature. You do them again and again and again on the project and make sure that the changing environment is adequately represented in your risk. And you're not just doing these processes once and you are done. Oh no, when you are done, you'll be doing them once again. Alright then, moving on to our ITTOs, to the inputs, tools, techniques and outputs. We see here figure 11-8 from the PMBOK guide that lists them for us. 5 inputs, 6 tools and techniques and just 1 output. And I think the most interesting thing to notice on this slide here, look at the output. The word risk doesn't even come up in the output. The only output we have is project documents updates. No mention of risks at all. Alright then, we have 5 inputs to this process, and they are the risk management plan, the scope baseline, the risk register, enterprise environmental factors, and organizational process assets. The process here is called perform qualitative risk analysis. So all of these inputs are supposed to help us perform a qualitative risk analysis. Let's take a look at each one in detail and see what information they contain that helps us perform that qualitative risk analysis. The risk management plan provides the following. It provides roles and responsibilities for conducting risk management, assessing budgets, scheduling activities, categorizing risk, defining probability and impact matrices, and revising and assessing stakeholder risk tolerances. Remember, the risk management plan is an output of the very first process here in project risk management, plan risk management, the process of defining how to conduct risk management activities for a project. So this plan will tell us exactly how are we going to perform the qualitative risk analysis, and it'll describe many of the criteria that we need for the analysis. Our second input, the scope baseline, is used for the qualitative analysis because common types of projects often have well-defined and understood risk. Conversely, state-of-the-art or cutting-edge projects are less well understood and require deeper analysis. So when we look at the scope baseline, we can already see what is the scope that we're going to have to build, and inherent in that scope is going to be some risk. So examining the scope baseline will give us an overall sense of the degree of risk for our particular project based on the scope that we're going to have to deliver. The risk register contains information that is used and required to assess and prioritize our risks. It contains things like the list of our identified risks, the detailed description for each risk, and already a list of potential responses. Okay, we want to perform a qualitative risk analysis. The risk register, in essence, is the list of all of our risks, so of course we're going to need and use that as an input to this process. The two final inputs, the enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets, help us because other people may have performed qualitative risk analysis on similar projects. Let's look at how we get this information. So, enterprise environmental factors include industry studies of similar projects by specialists or risk databases which may be available in the public domain or from proprietary sources. So people outside of our company who have done similar projects have information for us on qualitative risk analysis. And then the organizational process assets, that's everything that comes from in-house. The organizational process assets are needed because we may have performed qualitative risk analysis on projects in the past. The approach we took then may also be applied to this project. No sense in reinventing the wheel if our organization already knows how to do this. And with that, we have come to the end of part 1 of this lesson. So it's time for Justine to say,
see you around.
And of course I say, until next time.